The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Kingston Avenue as Margaret Chen carefully guided her silver Toyota Camry through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. At 72, she had made the same journey to Wong's grocery store every Thursday for the past 15 years, always taking the same route home with her weekly supplies of fresh vegetables and her favorite jasmine tea. Today had been no different. The trunk of her car held 4 neat paper bags filled with groceries, including special ingredients for the dinner she planned to cook for her grandchildren's weekend visit. The thought of their smiling faces made her lips curve into a gentle smile as she stopped at the red light near Palmer Street. Margaret was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver-streaked black hair that she always kept neatly pinned back. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, bouncing slightly as she drove. She wore her favorite blue cardigan, the one her son Thomas had given her last Christmas, over a simple white blouse and black slacks. The peaceful drive home took an unexpected turn when red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she carefully checked her speedometer. She had been going exactly at the speed limit, just as she always did. With trembling hands, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, making sure to stop well away from the fire hydrant on the corner of Maple Drive. Through her side mirror, Margaret watched as 2 police officers emerged from their patrol car. The taller one, who would later identify himself as Officer James Peterson, walked with an aggressive stride that made Margaret's stomach tighten with anxiety. His partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, followed a few steps behind, his hand resting casually on his belt. License and registration, Officer Peterson barked before Margaret could even lower her window completely. His tone was harsh, nothing like the friendly police officers she often saw chatting with shopkeepers in her neighborhood. "Yes, of course, officer," Margaret replied softly, her accent slightly more pronounced due to her nervousness. Her arthritic fingers fumbled with her purse as she searched for her wallet. She could feel Officer Peterson's impatient stare burning into her as she carefully pulled out her license. "Ma'am, I said license and registration," Peterson repeated loudly, as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. Margaret flinched at his tone but nodded politely, reaching across to open her glove compartment for the registration. As she stretched across the seat, her elbow accidentally bumped her purse, spilling some of its contents onto the floor. Her heart raced as she heard Officer Peterson let out an exasperated sigh. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he commanded sharply. From the passenger side, Officer Reynolds shone his flashlight into her car, the bright beam sweeping across the scattered contents of her purse, her phone, a pack of tissues, some mints, and her small pill organizer for her blood pressure medication. "Is there a problem, officer?" Margaret asked quietly, her hands now gripping the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2, just as she had taught her own children years ago. She could see curious onlookers beginning to slow down as they passed by, probably wondering why 2 police officers were hassling an elderly woman in broad daylight. "Your left tail light has a crack in it," Officer Peterson announced, his voice filled with unwarranted authority. "Are you aware that it's a violation to operate a vehicle with damaged lights?" Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh dear," she said, genuine concern in her voice. "I had no idea. My son Thomas is taking me to the mechanic next Tuesday. He noticed it last weekend when he visited." But Officer Peterson wasn't interested in her explanation. He was already scribbling in his notepad, his jaw set in a hard line. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered, his hand moving to rest on his holster, a completely unnecessary gesture that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Across the street, a young woman in a green apron from the local coffee shop had stopped sweeping the sidewalk. She was watching the scene unfold with growing concern, her phone now held up discreetly at chest level. What none of them knew at that moment was that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine, and Officer Peterson's day was about to take a turn he never expected. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to unbuckle her seatbelt. The arthritis in her fingers made even this simple task difficult, especially under the impatient stare of Officer Peterson. The early evening air felt chilly as she slowly stepped out of her car, her knee joints protesting with each movement. "Could I please stay in the car, officer?" Margaret asked politely, one hand steadying herself against the car door. "My arthritis makes it painful to stand for long periods." The wind rustled through her cardigan, making her shiver slightly. Officer Peterson's face hardened. "Ma'am, when an officer gives you an order, You follow it. No excuses. His partner, Officer Reynolds, continued to watch silently, his expression hidden behind dark sunglasses. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing to stop his partner's increasingly aggressive behavior. Margaret stood quietly, her small frame appearing even more fragile next to the towering officers. She could hear the whispers of people walking by, some slowing down to watch the scene unfold. A mother quickly guided her curious children across the street, throwing concerned glances over her shoulder. "Do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" Officer Peterson demanded, his voice unnecessarily loud. The question seemed ridiculous. Margaret Chen, wearing her neat cardigan and sensible shoes, looked about as threatening as a grandmother headed to a knitting circle, which she actually was every Wednesday afternoon. "No, officer, just my groceries," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly. She thought about the fresh bok choy and mushrooms in her trunk, wondering if they would spoil in the cooling evening air. Her grandchildren's favorite dumplings would have to wait. Officer Peterson began circling her car like a predator, his flashlight beam searching for any possible violation. He stopped at the tail light, pointing dramatically at a hairline crack barely visible in the red plastic. "This crack could cause serious accidents," he declared, though the light was clearly functioning perfectly. "I understand, officer," Margaret said softly. "As I mentioned, my son is taking me to fix it next week. I have the appointment card in my purse if you'd like to see it." She started to reach toward her car door. "Don't move," Peterson barked, causing Margaret to freeze in place. Several more passers-by stopped to watch now, including two elderly men from Margaret's church who recognized her immediately. They stood on the corner, speaking in hushed, worried tones. Sarah Martinez, the young barista from across the street, had moved closer, her phone still recording. She had served Margaret countless times at the coffee shop, always impressed by the older woman's kindness and the generous tips she left despite ordering only a simple green tea. "I'm going to search your vehicle," Officer Peterson announced, pulling on his black gloves with theatrical slowness. "Officer Reynolds, keep an eye on her." The way he said it made Margaret sound like a dangerous criminal instead of a respected retired librarian who volunteered at the children's hospital every weekend. As Peterson began roughly searching through her car, Margaret discreetly reached for her phone in her cardigan pocket. Her arthritic fingers moved slowly over the keys as she typed a brief message to her son Thomas. "Police stopping me on Maple Drive. Something wrong. Need help." Officer Peterson emerged from the car holding her pill organizer. "What's this?" he demanded, shaking the plastic container as if it were evidence of a serious crime. The rattle of her blood pressure medication echoed in the tense air. "Those are my prescribed medications, officer," Margaret explained patiently, though her heart was racing. "My doctor's information is on the labels." She could feel her blood pressure rising, the very condition those pills were meant to control. The young barista, Sarah, had moved even closer now, her phone capturing every moment of the officer's unprofessional behavior. She caught Margaret's eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. More cars were slowing down, some people taking out their phones to record the incident. What Officer Peterson didn't realize as he continued his unnecessary search was that Margaret's text message had already reached its recipient. And in just a few minutes, this power-drunk officer would learn a valuable lesson about judging people by their appearance. Because Margaret Chen wasn't just any elderly woman being harassed by the police. She was the mother of the city's newly appointed police commissioner, and help was already on the way. Sarah Martinez had been working at Bella's coffee shop for just over a year, and she knew all the regular customers by heart. Mrs. Chen was one of her favorites, always polite, always carrying a warm smile, and often sharing stories about her grandchildren during quiet afternoons over cups of green tea. Now, watching the elderly woman being harassed by two police officers, Sarah felt her blood boiling. The 23-year-old barista had stepped outside during her break to sweep the sidewalk when she first noticed the police lights. At first, she thought nothing of it, but when she recognized Mrs. Chen's silver Toyota, something didn't feel right. Sarah pulled out her phone and started recording, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Hey, Jenny," she whispered to her coworker through the coffee shop's door. "Cover for me a few more minutes. Something's not right across the street." Jenny peeked out and nodded, understanding immediately when she saw the scene unfolding. From her position, Sarah could hear Officer Peterson's loud, aggressive voice carrying across the street. The way he spoke to Mrs. Chen reminded Sarah of how bullies had treated her younger brother in school. All power and no respect. She zoomed in with her phone camera, making sure to capture clear footage of the officer's badge numbers and face. More people were gathering now. Mr. Wilson, who owned the hardware store 2 doors down, stood next to Sarah with his arms crossed. "That's Margaret Chen," he muttered, shaking his head. "She's been shopping here for decades. What are they thinking?" Sarah watched as Officer Peterson forced Mrs. Chen to stand in the cold while he searched her car. The elderly woman was visibly shaking, one hand pressed against her hip as if in pain. Sarah knew about Mrs. Chen's arthritis. She'd often helped her carry her tea to the table on bad days. "Someone should do something," a teenage boy said from behind Sarah. But everyone knew how risky it could be to interfere with police business, even when the officers were clearly overstepping their bounds. Sarah moved closer, pretending to sweep while keeping her phone recording. She caught clear footage of Officer Peterson roughly handling Mrs. Chen's belongings, throwing her neatly organized grocery bags around as he searched the trunk. The fresh vegetables Mrs. Chen had carefully selected now lay scattered across the car's interior. "Ma'am, what's in these bottles?" Peterson's voice boomed as he held up her prescription containers. Sarah zoomed in on this moment, knowing it showed clear harassment. Mrs. Chen's soft, patient explanation about her blood pressure medication was barely audible in comparison. Officer Reynolds, the younger cop, kept glancing around nervously. He seemed uncomfortable with his partner's behavior but remained silent. Sarah made sure to record his inaction too. Sometimes doing nothing was just as bad as doing wrong. The crowd kept growing. Sarah recognized several of Mrs. Chen's friends from the neighborhood. The couple who ran the dry cleaners, some ladies from her church group, and even Dr. Roberts from the clinic down the street. They all wore expressions of disbelief and anger. "I've already called some people who should know about this," Dr. Roberts whispered to Sarah as he passed by. "This isn't right." Sarah nodded, still recording. Her break had ended 10 minutes ago, but Jenny kept giving her thumbs up through the window, indicating she had things covered inside. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and Sarah could see Mrs. Chen shivering in her thin cardigan. She wanted to run across the street and offer her jacket, but she knew it was more important to keep recording. This kind of evidence could make a real difference. Through her phone screen, Sarah noticed Mrs. Chen discreetly sending a text message. A small smile of relief crossed the elderly woman's face after she pressed send. Whoever she had contacted, Sarah hoped help would arrive soon. Just then, Sarah's camera caught something interesting, a black unmarked car turning slowly onto the street. It parked quietly about 50 feet away from the scene. The man who stepped out wore an expensive suit and carried himself with authority. Even from a distance, Sarah could see his resemblance to Mrs. Chen. As she continued recording, Sarah realized she was about to witness something important. The man's determined walk and the confident way he adjusted his tie suggested he wasn't just another concerned citizen. This was someone with power, someone who could actually do something about this situation. The next few minutes, Sarah knew, would make all the difference. Her phone battery showed 20%, but she was determined to capture every second of what was about to unfold. Some stories needed to be told, and this one, she felt, might actually change things in their community. The message that appeared on Police Commissioner Thomas Chen's phone was brief but concerning. "Police stopping me on Maple Drive. Something wrong. Need help." His mother had never asked for help like this before. In his 23 years of police service, Thomas had learned that a mother's distress call was never to be taken lightly. He was in the middle of an important budget meeting when the text arrived, sitting at the head of a long conference table surrounded by precinct captains. The moment he read the message, he stood up abruptly, causing several officers to look at him with surprise. "Meetings postponed," Thomas announced firmly, already buttoning his suit jacket. "Family emergency." The other officers knew better than to question their commissioner. In the 3 months since taking office, Thomas Chen had earned both their respect and, in some cases, their fear. His reputation for addressing police misconduct was becoming legendary. As he strode through the police headquarters marble hallway, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, Thomas's mind raced with possibilities. His mother was the most law-abiding person he knew. She had never even had a parking ticket in her 45 years of driving. Something was definitely wrong. Sir, your signature is needed on these reforms, his assistant called out, hurrying after him with a stack of papers. Thomas didn't break his stride. Not now, Janet. Have my car brought around immediately. He pulled out his phone again, this time to check his mother's location. The GPS tracker app he had installed on his mother's phone, with her permission, of course, showed she was stopped on Maple Drive, just a few blocks from her regular grocery store. Thomas knew her Thursday routine by heart. She'd been following the same schedule since his father passed away 5 years ago. In the elevator, Thomas loosened his blue silk tie slightly. At 48 years old, he still maintained the fitness level of his early police academy days. The other occupants of the elevator pressed themselves against the walls, recognizing the commissioner's serious expression. Everyone knew that look. It meant trouble for someone. "Cars ready, sir," the security guard announced as Thomas emerged into the underground parking garage. His unmarked black Ford waited with the engine running. Thomas had insisted on driving himself since becoming commissioner. It helped him stay connected to the streets he'd sworn to protect. As he navigated through the city traffic, Thomas's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had with his mother just last weekend. They had been sitting in her kitchen, enjoying her homemade dumplings, when she mentioned seeing more aggressive police patrols in her neighborhood. She had brushed off his concerns then, saying she was probably just being oversensitive. Check the patrol assignments for Maple Drive sector. Thomas spoke into his phone, using the hands-free system. The computer's response came quickly. Officers James Peterson and Mike Reynolds, car 247. Thomas's jaw tightened. He recognized Peterson's name from 3 civilian complaints in the past month alone. At a red light, Thomas quickly typed Peterson's badge number into the department database. The officer's record showed a pattern that made the commissioner's blood pressure rise. Multiple complaints about aggressive behavior, particularly toward elderly and minority residents, all dismissed by the previous administration. Another text from his mother appeared. "Officer very angry. Making me stand outside, cold." Thomas's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. He was only 5 minutes away now, but those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear the police radio chatter from the sector. No official call had been logged for his mother's traffic stop. This meant the officers hadn't followed proper procedure, another violation to add to the growing list. As he turned onto Maple Drive, Thomas spotted the gathering crowd first. Then he saw his mother's silver Toyota, the police cruiser's lights still flashing behind it. Through the crowd, he could make out his mother's small figure standing in the cold, her blue cardigan, the one he had given her, providing little protection against the evening chill. Thomas parked his car at a distance, taking a deep breath to calm his rising anger. In his 23 years of service, he had learned that cold, controlled anger was far more effective than hot rage. As he stepped out of his car, straightening his suit jacket and tie, Thomas Chen wasn't just a concerned son anymore. He was about to remind these officers what real law enforcement looked like. Commissioner Thomas Chen emerged from his car with the calculated calm of a man who had spent decades in law enforcement. The evening air carried the murmurs of the growing crowd, but his focus remained entirely on the scene before him. From his position, he could clearly see Officer Peterson gesturing aggressively at his mother, who stood shivering in her blue cardigan. Thomas began walking toward the scene, his steps measured and deliberate. Several onlookers noticed him first, their expressions changing from concern to curiosity as they observed his approaching figure. The young barista with the phone camera, Sarah, immediately recognized something significant was about to happen and made sure to keep recording. His mother hadn't noticed him yet. She stood with perfect posture despite her discomfort, just as she had taught Thomas to do throughout his childhood. Even from a distance, he could see her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a habit she had when she was nervous but trying to remain dignified. "The trunk needs to be searched again," Officer Peterson was saying loudly, his voice carrying across the street. "And we'll need to verify every one of these prescription bottles." Thomas watched as his mother's groceries lay scattered across the sidewalk, her carefully selected vegetables rolling toward the gutter. Officer Reynolds, the younger cop, was the first to notice Thomas's approach. Something about the commissioner's purposeful stride and perfectly tailored suit made him straighten his posture instinctively. He nudged his partner, but Peterson was too engrossed in his power trip to pay attention. As Thomas got closer, he could hear more of the conversation. "Ma'am, if you can't provide proper documentation for these medications right now, Peterson was saying, holding up his mother's pill organizer. We'll need to take you down to the station. Thomas was now just 15 feet away when his mother finally saw him. Her eyes widened slightly, but her expression remained calm. Years of playing mahjong had given her an excellent poker face. She gave no indication that she knew the approaching man in the dark suit. "Officers," Thomas called out, his voice carrying the authority of his position. Both policemen turned toward him. "I believe there might be some confusion here." He stopped a few feet from them, positioning himself so that he was between the officers and his mother. The crowd had fallen completely silent. Sarah Martinez zoomed her camera in closer, capturing every detail of the moment. Even the traffic seemed to have quieted, as if the whole street was holding its breath. "This is a police matter, sir," Peterson said sharply, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. "Please step back." The officer's face was flushed with the arrogance of someone drunk on their own authority. Thomas reached slowly into his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He pulled out his credentials, letting the gold badge catch the evening light. "Police Commissioner Thomas Chen," he announced, his voice clear and firm, "and I believe you're currently harassing my mother." The color drained from Peterson's face so quickly it was almost comical. Officer Reynolds took an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over Mrs. Chen's spilled groceries. The crowd let out a collective gasp, and several phones were raised to capture the moment. "Commissioner, we were just..." Peterson stammered, suddenly looking much smaller in his uniform. The pill organizer in his hand trembled slightly as he quickly set it down on the car hood. "Mother," Thomas said softly, turning to Margaret while keeping the officers in his peripheral vision, "are you all right?" His voice carried genuine concern, though his professional demeanor never wavered. "I'm fine, son," Margaret replied calmly, though her hands were still shaking slightly. "Just a bit cold." Thomas immediately removed his suit jacket and placed it around his mother's shoulders, all while maintaining eye contact with the increasingly uncomfortable officers. The growing crowd watched in fascination as the scene transformed. Officer Peterson, who had been so intimidating just moments before, now looked like a schoolboy caught misbehaving. Officer Reynolds had begun picking up the scattered groceries, his face red with embarrassment. Thomas turned back to face the officers fully, his expression unreadable. The streetlights had come on, casting long shadows across the scene. In the gathering dusk, Commissioner Chen's authority seemed to fill the entire street. Everyone present knew they were about to witness something they would be talking about for years to come. Commissioner Thomas Chen stood beneath the streetlights, his presence commanding the entire scene. Officer Peterson's face had turned an interesting shade of pale, while Officer Reynolds continued frantically gathering the spilled groceries from the ground. The crowd watched in complete silence, phones recording every moment of this unexpected turn of events. "Your badge numbers, officers," Thomas said calmly, though everyone could hear the controlled anger in his voice. "State them clearly, please." He pulled out his own phone, opening the voice recorder app with practiced ease. "Officer James Peterson, badge number 7842. Peterson mumbled, his earlier arrogance completely vanished. His hands were shaking slightly as he tried to maintain a professional stance. "Officer Michael Reynolds, badge number 8915, the younger officer added quickly, nearly dropping the bag of oranges he had just picked up. The fruit rolled across the sidewalk, coming to rest near Sarah Martinez's feet. Thomas walked slowly around his mother's car, examining it with the trained eye of a veteran police officer. When he reached the tail light that had allegedly sparked this incident, he paused. "This crack," he said, pointing to the barely visible line in the red plastic, "this was your probable cause?" "Yes, sir," Peterson replied, his voice barely audible now. "It's a violation of Section 24. "I know the code, Officer Peterson," Thomas interrupted sharply. "I also know that according to department policy, a warning should be issued for first-time minor equipment violations, especially when the driver is a senior citizen with no prior records." From across the street, Mr. Wilson from the hardware store called out, "She's the nicest lady in the neighborhood, Commissioner. Comes by every week for her groceries." Several other voices joined in agreement, creating a chorus of support for Margaret. Thomas raised his hand slightly, and the crowd fell silent again. He turned to his mother, who still stood wrapped in his suit jacket. "Mother, would you please tell me exactly what happened here? From the beginning." Margaret Chen spoke softly but clearly, her dignity intact despite the ordeal. I was driving home from Wong's grocery when they pulled me over. Officer Peterson was very forceful. He made me stand out here despite my arthritis, searched my car twice, and questioned my prescription medications. Sarah stepped forward nervously. Sir, I have it all on video, she offered, holding up her phone. I've been recording since they first pulled her over. The way they treated Mrs. Chen, it wasn't right. Thomas nodded appreciatively at Sarah before turning back to the officers. Let me make sure I understand this situation correctly, he began, his voice taking on the tone he usually reserved for official hearings. You pulled over a 72-year-old woman for a minor equipment violation. Instead of issuing a warning, you subjected her to an aggressive search, made her stand in the cold despite her visible physical discomfort, and questioned her legally prescribed medications. Officer Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we were just following. Following what exactly? Thomas cut in. Because you certainly weren't following department procedures. You didn't call in this stop. You didn't log it in your system. And you definitely weren't following the new community policing guidelines I'd implemented last month. A small smile appeared on Margaret's face as she watched her son work. She had always been proud of his achievements, but seeing him in action, defending not just her but the principles of justice he believed in, made her heart swell with extra pride. Commissioner, if I could explain. Peterson tried again, but Thomas held up his hand. Your body cameras are on, correct? Thomas asked, though it wasn't really a question. Both officers nodded quickly. Good, because tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I want both of you in my office with your supervising sergeant. We'll review all the footage together, from your cameras, from Ms. Martinez's phone, and from the street cameras I can see on both corners. The crowd had grown larger now, with some people who had driven by earlier returning to see how the situation would end. The whispers of "That's the police commissioner," and "It's her son," rippled through the gathering. Thomas turned to Officer Reynolds, who still held an armful of his mother's groceries. Put those in the trunk properly, please. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Reynolds hurried to comply, carefully arranging the bags in the trunk, as if he were handling precious artifacts. The evening had grown darker, but the streetlights illuminated what would become a legendary story in their community, the day two overzealous officers learned a valuable lesson about power, respect, and the consequences of harassment. The next morning, the story of what happened on Maple Drive spread through the city like wildfire. Sarah Martinez's video had gone viral overnight, reaching over 1 million views on social media. Local news vans lined up outside the police headquarters, their satellite dishes reaching toward the morning sky like metal sunflowers. Inside the commissioner's office, Thomas Chen sat behind his large desk, his expression stern as he reviewed the footage from multiple sources. The body camera videos from both officers played on one screen, while Sarah's recording played on another. His mother's case file lay open on his desk, though he hardly needed to reference it. The events of the previous evening were burned into his memory. At exactly 9 a.m., Officer Peterson and Officer Reynolds entered the office, accompanied by their sergeant, David Martinez, no relation to Sarah. Both officers had dark circles under their eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. They stood at attention, their uniforms perfectly pressed as if proper clothing could somehow make up for improper behavior. Sit down, all of you, Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. He pressed play on one of the screens, and they all watched the scene unfold from the body camera's perspective. Peterson visibly flinched when he heard his own harsh voice demanding Margaret to step out of her car. In the last 12 hours, Thomas began, turning off the videos, my office has received over 200 calls and emails from concerned citizens. Many of them know my mother from her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, her church activities, or simply from her weekly shopping trips. He picked up a thick folder from his desk. But this isn't just about my mother. This morning, I had my team pull your complete service records. He looked directly at Peterson. Officer Peterson, in the past 6 months alone, you've had 7 complaints filed against you for aggressive behavior, particularly toward elderly and minority residents. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The sergeant beside him looked shocked. Clearly, he hadn't been aware of all the complaints. Thomas continued, Officer Reynolds, your record shows no direct complaints, but it does show a pattern of standing by while your partner engaged in questionable behavior. Outside the office, the entire department had gone unusually quiet. Everyone knew about the meeting taking place behind the commissioner's closed door. Janet, Thomas's assistant, had already fielded dozens of calls from reporters seeking comments about the incident. "Sir," Peterson finally spoke up, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I want to apologize for my behavior. If I had known she was your mother." "That's exactly the problem," Thomas interrupted sharply. "It shouldn't matter whose mother she is. Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Every elderly person struggling with arthritis deserves consideration. Every individual taking prescription medication deserves privacy." The sergeant nodded in agreement, looking increasingly disappointed with his officers. "Commissioner Chen is absolutely right," he added, speaking for the first time. "This isn't what we stand for as a department." Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the news vans below. "Officer Peterson, you're suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Officer Reynolds, you're being reassigned to desk duty and will undergo extensive retraining in community policing and active intervention." The punishment hit them like a physical blow. Peterson opened his mouth to protest but quickly thought better of it. Reynolds simply nodded, accepting his fate. "One more thing," Thomas added, turning back to face them. "My mother has agreed not to file a formal civil complaint on one condition." He paused, making sure he had their full attention. "Both of you will spend the next month working weekends at the Senior Community Center, helping elderly residents with their daily needs. Perhaps sometime serving our older citizens will help you understand the respect they deserve." As the officers and their sergeant left the office, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his mother. "Coming by with dumplings for lunch. Made extra for your staff." He smiled, realizing that even after everything that happened, his mother's kindness remained unchanged. The news vans would stay outside all day, the story would run on every local channel, and the video would continue to spread online. But the real impact would be felt in the quiet changes that followed, in how officers approached their duties, in how the community viewed their police force, and in how one incident became a catalyst for meaningful change in the department's culture. 3 months after the incident on Maple Drive, Margaret Chen sat in her usual spot at Bella's coffee shop, sipping her afternoon green tea. Sarah Martinez, now promoted to assistant manager, brought over a fresh plate of cookies, on the house as always. "Have you seen the changes at the police department, Mrs. Chen?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair across from Margaret. The young woman had become something of a local hero after her video helped bring attention to police conduct in their community. Margaret smiled warmly. "My son tells me interesting stories every Sunday dinner now." She picked up a cookie, remembering how different things had become since that evening in early spring. Officer Peterson had not returned to active duty. Instead, after his suspension, he had chosen to retire early. His mandatory volunteer work at the senior center had humbled him significantly. These days, people often saw him helping elderly residents carry their groceries, not because he had to anymore, but because he wanted to. Officer Reynolds, on the other hand, had transformed his career. After completing his retraining, he became an instructor at the police academy, specifically teaching new recruits about community policing and the importance of standing up against misconduct. He often used his own experience as a teaching example, showing cadets the video of that day and explaining everything he should have done differently. The police department itself had undergone significant changes. Commissioner Chen had implemented new training programs focusing on elderly and minority interactions. Every officer now had to spend one day each month working with community organizations, something that initially met with resistance, but gradually gained acceptance as officers began building genuine connections with the people they served. "Look outside, Mrs. Chen," Sarah pointed toward the window. A police car had pulled up, and 2 officers were helping an elderly man change his flat tire. One officer held an umbrella over the man to shield him from the sun, while her partner worked on the wheel. That wouldn't have happened 3 months ago. Margaret nodded, remembering how her son had insisted on installing new department policies. All interactions with elderly citizens now required a supportive approach. Officers were trained to offer assistance first and enforcement second. The change in attitude had dramatically improved community relations. The coffee shop's television was showing a news report about the department's latest initiative, a special unit dedicated to helping senior citizens with their daily challenges. The camera showed officers escorting elderly residents to medical appointments, helping them navigate public transportation, and conducting regular welfare checks on those living alone. "Your son did all this," Sarah said proudly, refilling Margaret's teacup. "But it started with you, Mrs. Chen. Your dignity that day, how you handled yourself, it showed everyone what real strength looks like." Margaret blushed slightly at the compliment. She hadn't wanted to become a symbol of change, but her experience had sparked something important in their community. The weekly seniors group she led at church had doubled in size, with many elderly residents feeling more confident about speaking up about their concerns. Thomas visited the coffee shop later that afternoon, as he often did now during his community walks. He wasn't just the police commissioner anymore. He had become a familiar face in the neighborhood, known for stopping to chat with residents and listening to their concerns. "Mother," he greeted Margaret with a warm hug. "How are the new officers treating everyone?" He asked this question often, wanting to ensure the changes weren't just superficial. "Very well," Margaret replied, her eyes twinkling. "Officer Jenkins helped Mrs. Rodriguez with her shopping yesterday, and Officer Thompson has been checking on Mr. Wilson since his wife went into the hospital." As they talked, more customers entered the coffee shop. Many stopped to greet Margaret, now something of a local celebrity. Children knew her as the nice lady who reads stories at the library on Saturdays. Teenagers recognized her as the woman who had stood up to police misconduct. Adults saw her as a symbol of dignity and positive change. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the coffee shop windows. Margaret watched as another police car drove by slowly, the officers inside waving at pedestrians. She remembered that frightening evening 3 months ago, how cold and helpless she had felt. But now, sitting in the warm coffee shop, surrounded by community members who had become like family, she felt only gratitude. The incident that could have left her bitter had instead become a catalyst for positive change. Her son had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for reform, and their community had grown stronger because of it. As Margaret finished her tea, she smiled, knowing that sometimes the best changes come from the most unexpected moments.